Tonight, I want to invite you on a journey, but not just to any place. We will slowly drift away from modern lights, from the noise of fast days, and gently slip into the past, into an ancient, mysterious time, a time full of splendor and silence. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the fire crackle softly beside you, as my voice guides you through an empire that shone for over 1,000 years, and yet, for many, remains wrapped in shadows. The Byzantine Empire. It was far more than a continuation of Rome. It was a world of its own, a bridge between East and West, a long, echoing song in the midst of the medieval dark. The city of golden emperors, of mosaics that sparkled like the sky, of floating domes, palace secrets, intrigue, war, and faith, and all of it bathed in the breeze that flowed from the Bosphorus across the most enigmatic city of all, Constantinople. This is the story of an empire that shouldn't have lasted so long, and yet endured for centuries. The story of Rome's final breath, and the birth of something entirely new. Chapter 1. The birth of a new Rome. Now listen calmly. Let me tell you how an empire was born. An empire that no longer exists, but held up Europe for centuries. It all begins when Rome was no longer what it once was. It had ruled the world, yes, but by the end of the 3rd century AD, things were going badly. Very badly. The borders were vast. Enemies were appearing everywhere, and emperors didn't last. One after another they fell, assassinated, betrayed, or simply forgotten. Then came Diocletian, an emperor who understood that the old Roman system no longer worked. In the year 285, he made a practical decision to divide the empire into 2 halves, a western half, with its capital first in Milan, and later in Ravenna, and an eastern half, with important centers like Antioch and Nicomedia. Each side would have its own emperor, its own army, its own political machinery. The idea wasn't to split it forever. It was just to govern more efficiently. But that division was like a crack, small at first, and over the years impossible to close. While the West grew weaker, poorer, more rural, the East, more urban, wealthier, and better connected to Asia, began to grow stronger. Years later, a young man appeared, Constantine, ambitious like the ancient consuls. He fought civil wars, defeated his rivals, and became the sole emperor. But he had another vision. He knew that Rome, the city, was no longer the best place to govern from. So, in the year 330 AD, he founded a new capital. He built it over a Greek city called Byzantium, right where Europe and Asia meet. It was a strategic point, protected by the sea, open to trade, easy to defend. He gave it his name, Constantinople, and he filled it with temples, columns, public buildings, statues brought from across the empire. He wanted it to be a modern Rome, a Christian Rome, because he, besides being its founder, was also the first emperor to convert to Christianity. With the Edict of Milan in the year 313, he legalized the religion that had been persecuted for centuries. And a few years later, he called the Council of Nicaea, where the foundations of imperial Christianity were defined. That changed everything. The ancient Roman world, with its gods and pagan temples, began to fade. The empire entered a new era, Christian, Eastern, more rigid, more spiritual. Years after Constantine, the problems returned. The Western Empire slowly began to fall. First, the Visigoths sacked Rome in the year 410. Then, the Vandals took Carthage. And finally, in the year 476, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The West had fallen. But in the East, Constantinople still stood. That's where what we now call the Byzantine Empire began. Of course, they didn't call themselves that. To them, they were still Romans, Romeoi in Greek. But the official language was no longer Latin, it was Greek. The culture leaned more toward Hellenism. And the emperor was no longer just a military leader. He was the representative of God on earth. It was a different empire. still with Roman roots, but with an Eastern soul. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, gradual, but steady. And with it, a new world was born, with a new capital, a new dominant faith, a new way to rule. Thus Byzantium began, not as a break from Rome, but as its continuation, adapted to a changing world. Chapter 2: Life in Constantinople. If you want to understand the Byzantine Empire, you must begin with its heart, the city of Constantinople. It was no ordinary city. It was built to last centuries, protected by the sea on 3 sides, and by massive defensive walls to the west. Double walls with towers, moats, and fortified gates that stood strong for nearly 1,000 years. Within those walls lived people of all kinds: Greeks, Latins, Armenians, Syrians, Jews, Egyptians. The city was a center of commerce, culture, religion, and power. And though many saw it as a capital of kings, for its citizens it was more than that. It was the center of the world. The city was well organized. There were public markets, the agoras, baths, aqueducts, schools, churches, hospitals. There were strict laws for trade, regulated weights and measures, taxes on almost everything. The government was strong and centralized. At the top was the emperor, head of state, supreme general, and also head of the church. Administrative positions were earned through merit or influence, and sometimes passed down through powerful families. The city had entertainment, too. The most important, the Hippodrome, a massive stadium where chariot races were held. Thousands gathered there, sometimes more than 30,000 people. And while it may have seemed like mere spectacle, it was actually politics in motion. The rival teams, the Greens and the Blues, were real political factions. They supported certain nobles, bishops, even emperors. The riots they sparked could be enormous, like the famous Nika revolt in the year 532, which nearly destroyed the entire city. But beyond politics, it was Christianity that shaped everything. In Constantinople, religion and state were not separated. The church held immense power. And over time, the Patriarch of Constantinople became the most important religious figure in Eastern Christianity. At the center of the city stood the great church of Hagia Sophia, built by Emperor Justinian. It was not just a temple, it was a symbol of the empire, a masterpiece of architecture, with a massive dome, golden mosaics, and columns brought from every corner of the Roman world. Imperial ceremonies, solemn masses, processions were held there. The emperor would enter wearing his crown, surrounded by incense, lights, and liturgical chants. For the faithful, it was like glimpsing heaven itself. Education was important, too. Children learned to read and write, sometimes in church schools or private homes. Higher studies included philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, law, and theology. Monasteries were another pillar of society. There, ancient manuscripts were copied, the sick were cared for, and the young were taught. Much of the knowledge from the ancient world survived thanks to Byzantine scribes. Daily life was harsh, like in any ancient city. There was poverty, disease, heavy taxation. But there was also a life rich in culture, in debate, in traditions blending Roman, Greek, and Christian elements. Constantinople was all of this at once. A sacred city, an imperial capital, an impenetrable fortress, and a living symbol of the survival of the ancient world in a new age. Chapter 3: Justinian and Theodora. Ambition, glory, and shadows of power. If there was ever a time when the Byzantine Empire seemed invincible, it was during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from the year 527 to 565. And one cannot speak of Justinian without speaking of his wife, Theodora, one of the most influential and enigmatic women in imperial history. Justinian was not born into the aristocracy. He came from humble origins in the region of Illyria, in what is now southeastern Europe. He arrived in Constantinople thanks to his uncle Justin I, a soldier who became emperor in 518. When Justin died, Justinian took the throne, with a clear and ambitious vision, to restore the former glory of the Roman Empire. And he tried. Oh, he certainly tried. The reconquest of the Mediterranean. Justinian wanted to reclaim the territories that Rome had lost in the west. To do so, he relied on one of the most brilliant generals in history, Belisarius. Under his command, the Byzantine armies achieved stunning victories. They defeated the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 534. They took Sicily and much of Italy after brutal wars against the Ostrogoths. They even conquered part of the Iberian Peninsula, held by the Visigoths. For a brief period, Justinian became lord of much of the Mediterranean once more. But these campaigns were costly, demanding massive sums of money, countless lives, and stirring internal tensions that would last for decades. What Belisarius won on the battlefield was often lost in revolts, famines, or new invasions elsewhere in the empire. The Code of Justinian. But Justinian didn't only want to conquer land, he wanted to organize the empire from within. One of his greatest achievements was the most ambitious legal reform of the ancient world, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Code of Justinian. Until then, Roman law was scattered, inconsistent, and full of contradictions. Under his orders, imperial jurists collected, revised, and organized centuries of Roman legal thought. The result was a coherent, powerful legal system that would influence all of Europe during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Even today, many modern legal systems are built on that foundation. Theodora, the unexpected empress. Theodora was far more than a royal consort. Her background was humble and scandalous by the standards of the time. She was the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome and an actress in her youth, a profession that carried a questionable reputation. But Justinian fell in love with her, and when he rose to the throne, he made her his empress. Far from a decorative figure, Theodora took an active role in governance. She defended women's rights, improved the legal status of prostitutes, and opposed abuses by members of the clergy. She was sharp, and many chroniclers agree that it was she who saved the throne during the devastating Nika revolt. In the year 532, Constantinople descended into chaos. The rival Hippodrome factions, the Greens and the Blues, united against the emperor, angry over taxes and general discontent. For days, the city burned. Thousands died. The rebels even declared a new emperor. Justinian was ready to flee, but Theodora refused. According to legend, she said, "The throne is a glorious shroud." She preferred to die with dignity rather than escape. Because of her resolve, the emperor acted. He ordered Belisarius to strike with the imperial guard. Around 30,000 rebels were killed in the Hippodrome. The city was left in ruins, but the throne was saved. Hagia Sophia and the reconstruction. After the revolt, Justinian launched a monumental reconstruction of the city. His most famous work was the Church of Hagia Sophia, completed in 537. It remained the largest church in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Its floating dome was an architectural marvel. Hagia Sophia was not just a place of worship. It was a declaration of power, of faith, and of beauty. It became the heart of Eastern Christianity, and the pride of Byzantium, the empire under threat. But such splendor came at a price. Constant warfare, heavy taxation, and a devastating plague in the year 541, known as the Plague of Justinian, weakened the empire deeply. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of the population died. Cities emptied, fields were left untended, and the army lacked recruits. Even so, Justinian ruled until his death in 565. His reign marked the high point of Byzantium in terms of imperial ambition. But it also left the empire exhausted. The legacy of an era. When Justinian died, the empire was no longer the same. It had reached its greatest territorial extent in centuries. It had a codified legal system, monumental architecture, and a firmly established religion. But it also faced enemies on all sides: Persians, Slavs, Bulgars, and soon the Arab peoples emerging from the desert. From this point onward, Byzantium would begin to withdraw and consolidate. But Justinian's dream, that fusion of faith, law, power, and glory, would forever shape the identity of the Byzantine Empire. And Theodora's name would endure as the woman who, against all odds, became a cornerstone of a throne built for men. Such was that era, grand, harsh, brilliant, and also fragile. Chapter 4: The Retreat of Byzantium, Burning Frontiers and the Struggle to Survive. The death of Justinian in the year 565 marked the end of an era of expansion. What followed was not an immediate fall, but a slow retreat, a forced adaptation to an increasingly hostile world. Throughout the 6th and 7th centuries, the Byzantine Empire faced a series of threats that forced it to reshape its structure, its politics, and its vision of power. No longer was the goal to reconquer the ancient world. Now, it was simply to survive. Wars on every front. First came the Sassanid Persians, longtime enemies from the east. In a brutal and drawn-out war, they even managed to sack Jerusalem in 614 and capture the True Cross. They pushed dangerously close to Constantinople. The war ended in 628, with a Byzantine victory under Emperor Heraclius, but the cost was devastating. Heraclius, a devout and energetic leader, managed to reorganize the army and strike back, even taking the war deep into Persian territory. But it was a bitter victory. The provinces were exhausted, finances ruined, and defenses worn thin. And then, almost without pause, came a new threat, faster, more ideological. Islam. From the 630s onward, the Arab Muslims, recently unified under Muhammad and his successors, began an unstoppable expansion. In just a few years, they took Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Everything Justinian had once reconquered, lost, and more. Byzantium didn't just lose land, it lost vital centers of trade, agriculture, and religion.
Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem.
Cities that had once been pillars of Eastern Christianity fell one by one. The wound ran deep. The siege of Constantinople, 674 to 678. One of the most critical moments came in the 7th century, when the Arabs besieged Constantinople by land and sea. For years, they launched massive attacks, but the city held. How? Thanks to its walls, its internal organization, and a secret weapon, Greek fire, an incendiary substance that could burn even on water. That victory saved the empire, and likely all of Eastern Europe, from Islamic conquest. It was a turning point. Constantinople became a near-mythical symbol of resistance. Internal changes, reorganizing the empire. During this time, the empire underwent a dramatic internal transformation. The old system of provinces was replaced by the themes, military regions governed by strategoi who held both civil and military power. This militarization was necessary to defend territory quickly and autonomously. The power of the urban aristocracy diminished, and cities lost their prominence. The economy became rural, the currency devalued, contact with the West grew weaker and weaker. Greek became the dominant language at all levels, completely displacing Latin. The empire drifted further from its Roman roots and solidified as a unique entity, Eastern, Christian, defensive, culture, religion, and tenacity. Even in the midst of crisis, Byzantine culture endured. Monks continued to copy ancient manuscripts in hidden monasteries. Theological debates spread across the empire. Icons were painted. Heresies argued. Sacred art gained new strength. The emperors became almost sacred figures themselves. The imperial court was a closed world, filled with ritual, hierarchy, symbols, and liturgy. The throne was not just a seat of power, but a reflection of divine order. A smaller but tougher empire. By the end of the 7th century, Byzantium had lost half of its territory. But it had survived. It had adapted. Justinian's dream was now in the past. The new goal was simpler, but just as vital: to endure, to protect Constantinople, to keep the flame of the empire alive. It was a different Byzantium, more austere, more Greek, more religious, but still standing. And from the ruins of great ambition, a harder, more realistic empire began to take shape, one prepared for the long centuries ahead. Chapter 5: the iconoclast controversy, an empire divided by faith. After resisting sieges, plagues, and the loss of vast lands, the Byzantine Empire entered a new phase of internal turmoil. This time, the danger didn't come from invaders or foreign armies, but from a spiritual crisis that would divide the empire for more than a century. The iconoclast controversy. This conflict didn't just pit ideas against each other. It divided regions, social classes, emperors, and church leaders. At the center of it all stood a seemingly simple question, but one with explosive consequences. Should sacred images be venerated? Is the worship of icons a form of idolatry, or a legitimate expression of Christian devotion? The roots of the conflict, images and power. In Byzantium, icons had been venerated for centuries. Images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, painted on wood panels or murals, used both in churches and in homes. For many believers, these icons were more than mere art. They were gateways to the divine, conduits through which God's grace touched daily life. People prayed before them, lit candles, placed flowers. But over time, doubts emerged. Some theologians and military leaders began to view icons with suspicion. To them, the practice had veered into idolatry, prohibited by the biblical commandments. These doubts were especially strong in Asia Minor, where rural and military communities were far from the urban tradition of image worship. And there was outside pressure too. Islam, a strict monotheistic religion that condemned all visual depictions of the divine. The Muslims were defeating Byzantium on many fronts, and some began to wonder, is God punishing us for our sins? For worshipping human images? Leo III and the start of iconoclasm. It was Emperor Leo III the Isaurian of Syrian origin, who in 726 decided to act. In a bold and controversial move, he ordered the ban of icons and the removal of sacred images from churches and public spaces. He argued that God was punishing the empire with military defeats and earthquakes. Because of idolatry, his orders were met with immediate resistance, especially in Constantinople and the western regions of the empire. Monks, the greatest defenders of icons, argued that the images were a legitimate expression of the incarnation. If Christ had become human, then he could and should be depicted. But Leo III was unyielding. He sent troops to destroy icons, shut down monasteries, and arrested defiant clergy. In 730, he issued an official edict banning the use and veneration of religious images. The empire plunged into a long and painful conflict, a struggle that divided all. Iconoclasm wasn't just a theological debate. It affected every part of Byzantine life. Politically, the iconoclast emperors reinforced their power over the church and monastic communities. Socially, families, regions, and cities were torn apart. Urban areas tended to support icons, while rural interiors leaned toward iconoclasm. Culturally, countless religious artworks were destroyed. Frescoes, mosaics, illuminated manuscripts, a devastating loss to Byzantine heritage. Internationally, tensions rose with the papacy in Rome, which firmly rejected iconoclasm. This deepened the divide between East and West, laying the groundwork for the Great Schism of 1054. Two phases of the conflict. The iconoclast crisis had two major phases, separated by a brief restoration of icons. First phase, 726 to 787. This first wave began under Leo III and was intensified by his son, Constantine V, who persecuted icon defenders even more fiercely. In 754, he convened the Council of Hieria, which declared iconoclasm official imperial doctrine. Under his rule, monasteries were harshly repressed. Many monks were tortured or executed. He also purged the army of iconophiles and promoted a more austere form of Christianity. One focused on obedience to the emperor and the defense of the empire. However, after his death, things began to shift. In 787, Empress Irene, acting as regent for her young son, convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which declared the veneration of icons legitimate and condemned iconoclasm as heresy. It was an attempt to reconcile with Rome and with Byzantium's own tradition. Second phase, 814 to 843. Iconoclasm wasn't over. In 814, under Emperor Leo V the Armenian, the ban on icons was reinstated. This second period was less violent, but still destructive. For nearly 30 more years, icon defenders were marginalized and persecuted. The final solution came thanks to another woman, Empress Theodora, widow of Emperor Theophilos. In 843, she officially restored the veneration of icons. To this day, the Orthodox Church commemorates that moment as the triumph of orthodoxy, celebrated every year on the first Sunday of Lent. Lasting consequences. Though the iconoclast crisis was resolved, its scars remained. Many monasteries had been plundered, their libraries destroyed, and their influence diminished. Byzantine art changed, becoming more symbolic, more abstract, more focused on spirituality than realism. The conflict also cemented the emperor's power over the church, reinforcing the concept of Caesaropapism, the idea that the emperor held both political and spiritual authority. To further widen the divide with Rome, the papacy, which never accepted iconoclasm, grew increasingly distant from Byzantium. This estrangement would culminate in the formal split of the Eastern and Western churches in 1054. More than a religious debate, in the end, the restoration of icons was not just a theological victory. It was a reaffirmation of Byzantine identity, its love of beauty, its sensory experience of the sacred, its deep connection between art, liturgy, and faith. Orthodox iconography, with its penetrating saints, melancholic madonnas, and golden scenes, flourished like never before. Churches were once again filled with images, not as objects of worship, but as windows to heaven, as visual reminders of the divine presence in human history. And so, a crisis that nearly tore the empire apart ended, ironically, by strengthening its character. The Byzantine soul survived the storm, and its faith, tested by fire, sword, and dogma, emerged even stronger, but not unscarred. The battle for the soul of the empire revealed how fragile its unity could be, and how deep the rift between throne and altar could grow. Byzantium had overcome spiritual division, but new threats already loomed: external enemies, palace intrigue, and perhaps most dangerously, a growing disconnect between imperial power and its people. The clock kept ticking, and Byzantium, though still majestic, now carried the weight of its scars, and a faith that, after the storm, shone even more brilliantly beneath the golden shadows of its domes. Chapter 6. The Macedonian Renaissance, rebirth amid ruins and wisdom. The iconoclast storm had passed, leaving behind more than a century of internal strife that had deeply weakened the cohesion of the empire. But as so many times before, Byzantium did not fall. Adaptable and resilient, the empire entered a new chapter. The Macedonian Renaissance, a period that began around the year 867 and extended for over 2 centuries. This era represented a political, military, artistic, and intellectual revival. It wasn't a return to the glorious days of Justinian, but rather the consolidation of a new Byzantium, more Greek, more Orthodox, more stable, yet surprisingly brilliant. The Macedonian dynasty and its legacy. The rise of the Macedonian dynasty began with Basil I, a peasant of Armenian origin who, after years of military service and clever political alliances, ascended the imperial throne in 867, after assassinating Emperor Michael III. His rule marked the beginning of a succession of capable emperors who would restore the empire's strength and prestige. During this period, Byzantium expanded its territory, reclaimed lost provinces, and reinforced its eastern border against the Arabs. Thanks to internal reforms, military improvements, and skilled diplomacy, the Macedonian dynasty consolidated imperial power and reduced corruption within the administration. Military revival and foreign policy. The Arab threat, which had dominated previous centuries, began to wane. The empire regained control over parts of Asia Minor, Armenia, and the Levantine coast. In the Balkans, the emperors launched campaigns to subdue the Slavs and contain the power of the Bulgarians, long-standing and dangerous rivals. One of the most prominent figures was Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, Bulgaroktonos, who ruled from 976 to 1025. Basil was a tireless and capable emperor who dedicated his life to military campaigns. His total defeat of Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria and the annexation of Bulgarian territories secured Byzantine dominance in the Balkans for decades. Diplomacy was also key. Byzantium masterfully used marriage alliances, trade agreements, and religious influence. One of its greatest diplomatic achievements was the conversion of the Slavic peoples to Orthodox Christianity, including the baptism of Prince Vladimir of Kiev, planting the seeds for the future Kievan Rus, which would one day see itself as Constantinople's spiritual heir. A cultural and artistic revival. The Macedonian Renaissance was not only military and political, it was also a profound intellectual awakening. In Constantinople, classical studies were revived, ancient manuscripts were collected, and new historical, theological, and philosophical works were written. The emperors promoted a deeply Byzantine culture, profoundly Christian, but firmly rooted in Greco-Roman heritage. Copyist monks, court scholars, and imperial chroniclers worked to preserve and transmit the wisdom of antiquity. Architecture flourished once again. Grand churches were built, adorned with golden mosaics and radiant domes, symbolizing the empire as a reflection of God's kingdom on earth. The image of the emperor once again occupied the center of Byzantine ceremony, portrayed as the bridge between heaven and earth. A strengthened Byzantine identity. This period helped consolidate a fully developed Byzantine identity. They no longer saw themselves as Eastern Romans, but as heirs to a unique imperial, Orthodox, and Greek tradition. The official language of the empire was Greek. The art was Byzantine. The religion was Orthodox. And the city of Constantinople was, unquestionably, the spiritual and political heart of the Orthodox world. While Western Europe languished in feudal wars and dynastic crises, Byzantium shone as a beacon of stability, culture, and refinement. Its ambassadors, artists, and monks influenced peoples as distant as the Russians, Serbs, Georgians, and Bulgarians. But beneath the gold, cracks. Yet this rebirth concealed certain weaknesses. The concentration of power in the throne, though effective under strong emperors, became dangerous under weak rulers or child emperors manipulated by court factions. Palace intrigues, rivalries among military elites, and constant pressure on the frontiers never truly vanished. Moreover, aristocratic families began to amass lands and privileges, gradually weakening the rural foundations of the empire and undermining the theme system, which had long been key to its defense. Even so, by the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th, the Byzantine Empire had reached one of its most splendid heights since the days of Justinian. It was respected, feared, and admired. But, as so often in Byzantine history, the peak was followed by the precipice. And the next fall would be slow, painful, and nearly irreversible. The skies were beginning to darken once again. Chapter 7. The beginning of decline. Shadows behind the splendor. When Basil II died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire appeared to be at its height. Its borders were secure. The imperial treasury overflowed with gold. Its enemies had been vanquished, and Constantinople shone as the jewel of the Christian East. Yet after decades of stability and expansion, the great emperor's death left a void that no one could truly fill. What followed was a string of mediocre rulers, internal strife, and strategic missteps that slowly eroded the foundations of the Macedonian Renaissance. A new era had begun, the gradual but steady decline of Byzantium. A lack of strong leadership. Basil II left no direct heirs. The throne passed to his brother, Constantine VIII, a weak-willed man with little political experience. He ruled for barely 3 years and left power to his daughter Zoe, who became empress and shared the throne with several husbands and lovers, in a cycle of palace intrigues that discredited imperial authority. Over the following decades, the throne was passed between emperors installed by the nobility, ambitious generals, or figures manipulated by court elites. Instability became the norm. The imperial bureaucracy grew inefficient. Taxes rose to sustain the court's luxury, and the army began to deteriorate. The collapse of the military system. One of the most damaging legacies of this era was the dismantling of the theme system, military administrative divisions that had allowed Byzantium to maintain strong local armies, especially in frontier regions. Suspicious of provincial generals, the new emperors began to replace local troops with foreign mercenaries. These hired soldiers were costly, unreliable, and loyal only to their pay. Meanwhile, lands once granted to soldier farmers were seized by aristocrats, further eroding the empire's defensive capacity. The result was catastrophic. When new threats arose at the borders, Byzantium no longer had a solid internal military structure to repel them. External pressures. Normans, Pecheneg, and Turks. The 11th century brought a new wave of enemies. In the west, the Normans began conquering southern Italy, stripping Byzantium of its last holdings in the peninsula. In the Balkans, the Pecheneg, a nomadic steppe people, launched frequent raids, sacking cities and spreading chaos. But the greatest threat came from the east. In the lands of the former Abbasid Caliphate, a new power emerged. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic tribe that had embraced Islam and swiftly began expanding into Anatolia, the agricultural and military heart of the empire. The emperors failed to recognize this threat until it was far too late. Corruption, luxury, and loss of prestige. As the borders crumbled, the court of Constantinople drowned in corruption. Eunuchs and bureaucrats controlled key positions. Taxes grew more oppressive. The nobility accumulated lands and privileges unchecked. Empresses Zoe and Theodora ruled for an extended period, but their policies focused more on maintaining court control than strengthening the empire as a whole. The court's extravagance stood in stark contrast to the growing misery in the provinces. Palace intrigues became so frequent that blinding political rivals became a common tactic to disqualify them from succession. Political violence no longer came from foreign foes. It came from the heart of power itself. Religious division, the road to schism. Amid this structural fragility, another conflict, less visible but equally dangerous, began to take shape. The religious divide between East and West. For centuries, cultural, linguistic, and theological differences between the Church of Rome and the Church of Constantinople had been growing. Byzantines spoke Greek, Latins spoke Latin. The East followed the Orthodox Rite, the West the Roman Rite. Even the way they made the sign of the cross was different. Tensions grew over the Pope's claims to universal authority. The patriarchs of Constantinople rejected this, defending the autonomy of their church. Things worsened under Patriarch Michael Cerularius, who openly criticized Latin practices. In 1054, a papal envoy excommunicated Cerularius on behalf of Pope Leo IX. The Patriarch responded by excommunicating the legates. This event marked the Great Schism between East and West, a rupture that still divides the Orthodox and Catholic churches. At the time, it seemed reversible, but the wound cut deep. A strong yet fractured empire. Despite all this, by the mid-11th century, Byzantium still had resources, prestige, and influence. Constantinople remained an awe-inspiring city. Trade with Europe and the Islamic world thrived. The empire's cultural influence stretched across continents. But its foundations were weakening. The army had become a shadow of its former self. The aristocracy dominated rural life. The provinces were resentful. The church was divided from the rest of Christendom. And most dangerously of all, the throne had become a prize everyone desired. Yet few knew how to govern. Byzantium was entering a new phase. The balance so carefully achieved during the Macedonian Renaissance was beginning to crumble. And the next great shock, brutal and decisive, was already looming on the horizon. A single battle, far off in the plains of Armenia, would forever alter the empire's destiny. And meanwhile, in golden chapels and marble halls, many still believed the empire was eternal, unaware that beneath their feet, the columns had already begun to crack. Chapter 8. Manzikert and the Fourth Crusade. After the death of Empress Theodora in 1056, the last direct representative of the Macedonian dynasty, the Byzantine Empire entered a new era of political, military, and spiritual instability. Over the next century, a succession of short-sighted emperors, internal strife, and strategic blunders left the empire exposed to threats that would not only weaken it, but break it apart from within and without. This was a century of chained catastrophes, misguided decisions, and unforgivable betrayals. And at its core, two events would forever change Byzantium's destiny: the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The Battle of Manzikert, 1071, the fall of Anatolia. The tragedy began on the plains of Armenia, near the city of Manzikert, where Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes attempted to halt the advance of the Seljuk Turks, led by Sultan Alp Arslan. It was one of the last desperate efforts to restore Byzantine military power. Romanos assembled a sizable army, composed of Byzantine troops, Norman mercenaries, and Armenian contingents. But the army was divided and riddled with intrigue. One of the empire's most powerful generals, Andronikos Doukas, betrayed Romanos during the battle. The result was catastrophic. The Byzantine army was annihilated. The emperor himself was captured by Alp Arslan. Though treated honorably and released shortly after, the humiliation was irreversible. Anatolia, the agricultural and demographic heart of the empire, was left undefended. In the following decades, waves of Turkish tribes settled the region, founding what would become the Sultanate of Rum. Byzantine control over Asia Minor evaporated within a generation. The loss of Anatolia meant the loss of hundreds of thousands of peasants, soldiers, and vital tax revenue. Byzantium, which had endured in these lands for centuries, now retreated toward the Aegean and the Balkans. This was the beginning of the end for the empire's traditional structure. Internal chaos and the rise of the Komnenoi. After the disaster at Manzikert, the empire plunged into a cycle of coups, civil wars, and short-lived emperors. The nobility carved up the empire for themselves, and private armies flourished. The throne became a prize rather than a responsibility. This cycle was partly broken with the rise of Alexios I Komnenos in 1081. Founder of the Komnenian dynasty, Alexios consolidated his power through military and fiscal reforms and bold foreign policy. Most importantly, he was the one who opened the door to the Crusaders. In search of aid against the Turks, Alexios sent envoys to Pope Urban II, whose response was to launch the First Crusade. While the Crusaders helped recover some coastal cities, they also sowed seeds of distrust between East and West. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as corrupt and decadent. The Byzantines, in turn, viewed the Crusaders as arrogant barbarians who pillaged what they claimed to protect. The next generations, partial reconstruction and dangerous arrogance. The Komnenoi, especially John II and Manuel I, achieved a degree of stability and recovery in the 12th century. They strengthened defenses, expanded influence in the Balkans, and negotiated skillfully with foreign powers. Constantinople flourished again, and trade with Venice and Genoa brought renewed wealth. But the cost was high. The emperors granted excessive commercial privileges to the Italian republics, ceding control over ports and markets. Latin colonies proliferated in the city, gradually undermining the local economy. Manuel I Komnenos made critical mistakes, intervening in unnecessary wars in Italy and Hungary, which left the empire exhausted. After his death, imperial weakness returned. The nobles resumed their power struggles, and the aristocracy tightened its grip while the populace sank deeper into poverty. The Fourth Crusade, betrayal and cataclysm. In this context of fragility came the most devastating event in all Byzantine history, the Fourth Crusade. Originally intended to reclaim Jerusalem, the Crusaders, pressed by debt to Venice, agreed to divert their campaign to Constantinople in exchange for payment and political favors. The excuse was to restore Isaac II Angelos and his son Alexios IV, who had been deposed. But when the Byzantines failed to pay what they had promised, the Crusaders laid siege to and sacked Constantinople in April 1204. It was an unprecedented catastrophe. Churches and monasteries were desecrated, imperial treasures stolen, women raped, and archives destroyed. The great imperial library was burned. Sacred relics were taken to Rome, Venice, and other European cities. Constantinople, the richest city in the Christian world, was turned to rubble by those who claimed to share its faith. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, 1204 to 1261, After the conquest, the Crusaders established the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, ruled by Frankish and Venetian nobles. They tried to impose Catholicism on an Orthodox city, provoking hatred and resistance. Meanwhile, surviving Byzantines regrouped in several successor states: the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond. The most successful was Nicaea, led by the Laskarid dynasty. For more than half a century, these states fought to reclaim the capital. Finally, in 1261, General Alexios Strategopoulos, serving Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos of Nicaea, entered Constantinople with a small army while the Latin forces were away. The city was retaken. The empire was restored. But nothing would ever be the same. The aftermath of the Fourth Crusade. Though Constantinople returned to Byzantine hands, the restoration was largely symbolic. The city was devastated, its population reduced, and its economy shattered. The empire was no longer a power, but a fragile state surrounded by enemies. The Fourth Crusade had broken not only the body of Byzantium, but also its spirit. The betrayal by fellow Christians deepened the rift between East and West. The Great Schism became irreparable. Trust in Rome turned to hatred. What had once been the heart of a united Christian world was now a symbol of a fractured, selfish, and violent Christendom. The wound of 1204 never fully healed. Though Byzantium would survive for 2 more centuries, it would never again be the beacon of power and culture it once was. Time was running out, and on the horizon loomed a new enemy, not from the Christian West, but the Islamic East. The young and ambitious Ottoman Empire was sharpening its swords. Chapter 9, The Twilight of Byzantium. Centuries of resistance, years of desperation. On August 15, 1261, when the troops of Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople through an unguarded gate, the people wept and rejoiced. After 57 years of Latin occupation, the imperial capital returned to Byzantine hands. But what seemed like a new beginning was, in truth, the beginning of the end. What remained of the empire was only a shadow of its former glory. The Palaiologan restoration, symbolic victory, structural defeat. The Palaiologan dynasty, which would rule until the empire's final fall, inherited a devastated state. Constantinople was half in ruins. Its population had drastically declined. The Latin quarters lay in rubble. Wealth had vanished, foreign merchants controlled what little trade remained, and the provinces were either independent or under occupation. Michael VIII Palaiologos tried to rebuild the empire, but his priorities were political, not economic or social. He reinstated the bureaucratic apparatus, partially reformed the army, and struggled to maintain an image of grandeur that no longer matched reality. Enemies on all sides, the restored empire faced a flood of threats. In the West, the Latin kingdoms established by the Crusaders still lingered. In the Balkans, the Serbs, Bulgarians, and Hungarians sought to fill the power vacuum left by Byzantium. In the East, the Seljuk Turks had given way to a more dangerous foe, the Ottomans. Born as a small Turkish beylik, principality, in the borderlands of Anatolia, the Ottomans began an unstoppable expansion under leaders like Osman I and Orhan. City by city, they pushed the Byzantines back toward the Aegean coast and the Straits of the Bosporus. Lacking a strong army, a stable economy, and reliable allies, the empire turned to desperate measures. Political marriages, the cession of fortresses, forced conversions, and often begging the West for help. A fragmented empire, civil wars, and rivalries. What little remained of Byzantium was further fractured by internal civil wars. Between 1321 and 1354, the empire endured 2 consecutive civil wars, pitting legitimate emperors against usurpers, regents against heirs, aristocratic factions against rival clans. These conflicts further weakened central authority. To win these wars, emperors sought help from foreign powers, including the Ottoman Turks, who began establishing a military presence in Europe. In its desperation, Byzantium opened the gates to the very enemy that would destroy it, the Ottoman advance and the fall of the provinces. While Byzantine emperors fought among themselves, the Ottomans crossed the Hellespont and gained their first foothold in Europe in 1354 by occupying the strategic fortress of Gallipoli. From there, their expansion was swift and relentless. They captured Edirne, Adrianople, and made it their capital. They secured control over Thrace, Macedonia, and moved deep into the Balkans. At every step, the Byzantines ceded territory or signed humiliating treaties to avoid open war. The empire shrank to a narrow coastal strip, a few scattered islands, and above all to the city of Constantinople, still defiant, but now little more than an imperial relic surrounded by a hostile world. Attempts at union with Rome, faith traded for survival. Desperate for military aid from the West, Byzantine emperors sought reconciliation with the Catholic Church, not as a theological gesture, but as a political transaction. In exchange for troops, they offered to unite the churches. Emperor John VIII Palaeologos personally attended the Council of Florence in 1439, signing an agreement that, in theory, ended the schism between East and West. But in Constantinople, the agreement was met with outrage and rejection. The Orthodox clergy, the people, and the monks saw it as a betrayal of their faith for the sake of convenience. Western powers did not respond as hoped. Some contingents arrived, but they were far too few to stop the Ottoman advance. The union of the churches did not save the empire, it only deepened internal division. The final defense, Constantine XI and a sealed fate. In 1449, Constantine XI Dragus Palaeologos ascended the throne as the last Byzantine emperor. Brave, devout, and resolute, Constantine knew his destiny was to resist. Meanwhile, in the east, the young and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II rose to power, driven by a singular dream, to conquer Constantinople and make it the jewel of his empire. In April 1453, Mehmed II arrived at the walls with an army of over 100,000 men and modern artillery, including a massive cannon forged by Hungarian engineers. The city had fewer than 8,000 defenders, including Greeks and a small Genoese contingent led by Giovanni Justiniani. The siege lasted 53 days. The walls held heroically. Each night, citizens repaired the breaches by hand. In the churches, liturgies were held without pause. Constantinople, though wounded, fought with the dignity of a 1,000-year-old empire. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans breached the walls. Justiniani was wounded. The defenders fell back. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting, sword in hand, refusing to flee. According to legend, he vanished among the last defenders, a martyr to his homeland. The fall and the birth of a new empire. The city was sacked as was customary in war. Churches were desecrated. Hagia Sophia, the symbol of orthodoxy, was turned into a mosque. The world changed forever. With the fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist after more than 1,000 years of history. But it did not die without leaving a legacy. Its culture, its writings, its faith, its art, all survived. The Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy brought with them ancient manuscripts, philosophical ideas, and classical works. These men and their books helped ignite the flame of the European Renaissance. The soul of Byzantium did not die within its walls. It was reborn in Florence, Venice, and Rome, the echo of an eternal civilization. The empire had been Roman, Greek, and Christian. It had served as a bridge between East and West. For centuries, it stood as the bulwark of Orthodox faith, the guardian of ancient wisdom, the refuge of the persecuted. And though its banner fell, its story never vanished. In every Orthodox icon, in every Byzantine dome, in every classical manuscript, Byzantium still lives, like a silent, eternal beacon shining through the pages of history. And so, dear listener, our journey comes to an end. We have sat by the warmth of memory and walked together through more than 1,000 years of history. From the ashes of Rome to the final flames of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire has shown us the majestic and tragic course of a civilization that lived between glory and ruin, between faith and the sword, between heaven and earth. It was in Byzantium where the old and the new embraced. There, the Greek language sang the words of the Bible. Emperors, clad in gold and purple, prayed beside their people, and the Theodosian walls withstood what seemed impossible. There, the reason of Aristotle coexisted with the mysticism of the Church Fathers. There, In the marble corridors and golden domes, dogmas, heresies, conquests, treaties, and miracles were born. We saw the birth of an empire of dreams. Constantine founding his eternal city, looking toward the rising sun. We witnessed the greatness of Justinian and Theodora, who rebuilt not just cathedrals, but the very soul of the empire. We saw the empire resist sieges, plagues, and losses, only to rise again and again, ever more wounded, but never without dignity. We saw how the debate over sacred images tore apart families, provinces, and patriarchs. We saw the brilliance of the Macedonian Renaissance shine like a noonday sun, and how arrogance, greed, and indifference slowly extinguished its light. History took us to Manzikert, where betrayal sealed the fate of Anatolia, to Constantinople, where Christians who should have defended the city instead sacked it in the name of God. And finally, to the year 1453, when the last walls fell, but not the spirit of those who defended them. Emperor Constantine XI fell with sword in hand, knowing he died not only for a city, but for an entire world. His death was not the end. It was the culmination of a 1,000-year story. Today, the stones of Hagia Sophia still whisper prayers. Byzantine mosaics still shine with the light of centuries past. The ideas born within those walls still beat in our universities, our churches, our art. The legacy of Byzantium is not measured in conquered lands, but in the culture it sowed, the faith it passed on, the silent strength it left behind. Because although the empire fell, Byzantium did not die. It lives in every corner where history is loved, where answers are sought in the shadows of time, where the past is viewed not only with nostalgia, but with gratitude. So now, as you close your eyes, imagine the echo of footsteps in the halls of the great palace. Hear the distant chants of Orthodox monks rising through the night. Feel the wind over the Bosphorus brushing against the domes that still rise, proudly, toward the sky. And remember, somewhere in the soul of history, Byzantium still burns, not with fire, but with memory. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. May knowledge walk beside you. May history inspire you. And may your dreams tonight be made of golden mosaics and calm seas. Good night.